I'm super excited about this event and about having both Dr. Zaire, Dinzey-Flores, and Dr. Tanya Herńandez with us today. And I'm going to do a brief presentation on each one. But before I start, I would like to thank the Divisional Dean of the Humanities, Amy Hungerford, for the support of the 320 York Humanities Grant, administered by Matthew Jacobson of the Public Humanities Support, and also for the support, especially for the support of the Center for Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, its director, Stephen Peedy, and our amazing staff, Matthew Tanico and Nandi Cummings, who have done so much of the coordination to make this possible, and they have just gone way beyond the call of duty here. So first, I want to introduce Dr. Tanya Herńandez. Dr. Tanya Herńandez is a professor of law at Fordham University School of Law, where she teaches comparative employment discrimination, critical race theory, and trust and states. She received her BA from Brown University and her JD from up the street at the Yale Law School, where she served as Note Topics editor of the Yale Law Journal. She has served as a faculty fellow at the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers University and as a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. In 2009, Professor Herńandez was elected to the American Law Institute, and in 2007, Hispanic Business Magazine selected her as one of the 100 most influential Hispanics, they call. Professor Herńandez's scholarly interest is in the study of comparative race relations and anti-discrimination law, and her work in the area has been published in the California Law Review, Cornell Law Review, Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, and the Yale Law Journal, amongst other publications. As a law and public affairs fellow at Princeton, Dr. Herńandez conducted research on the topic of Latino interethnic racism in the workplace and its implications for the enforcement of employment discrimination law. Her new book, which we have actually book order forms for, and I encourage you to look at them. Her new book, Multiracial and Civil Rights, Mixed Race Stories of Discrimination, was published by NYU Press in 2018, just last year. In this recent book, Professor Herńandez explores the question of how to pursue racial equality in a growing multiracial world. The growth of a mixed-race population has led some commentators to proclaim that multiracial discrimination is distinct in nature from the racial discrimination that non-multiracial persons experience, and that as a consequence, a whole new approach to civil rights law is required. And she talks about this and challenges different approaches to this idea. Dr. Herńandez describes her own experience as an Afro-Latina mixed-race person, and then shares how she tracks down the court case narratives of multiracial discrimination and the story of racial privilege they revealed in this book. She does that. The stories she uncovered are especially timely, and coming at a time when explicit racism is resurfacing. Dr. Herńandez looks at multiracial discrimination cases, and this look is essential for fortifying the focus of civil rights law on racial privilege. I also want to introduce Dr. Zaire Dinzey-Flores. Dr. Dinzey-Flores is Associate Professor in the Departments of Latino and Caribbean Studies and Sociology at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, where she teaches courses in urban studies, architecture and urban planning, social inequality, space, race, place, and the built environment, Latin American and Caribbean housing policy, and the African diaspora. Professor Dinzey-Flores earned her BA in sociology from Harvard University, an MA in sociology from Stanford, and a master's in urban planning and PhD in sociology and social policy from the University of Michigan. Professor Dinzey-Flores' research focuses on understanding how urban space mediates community life and race, class, and social inequality. She uses an interdisciplinary lens, mixed method approaches, and often a comparative Caribbean-U.S. framework to investigate the processes that cement the built environment and unequally distribute power. Her book, Locked In, Locked Out, Gated Communities in a Puerto Rican City, was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2013 and was the winner of the prestigious Robert E. Park Award of the Community Urban Sociology section of the American Sociological Association in 2014, and an honorable mention of the 2014 Frank Bonilla Book Award of the Puerto Rican Studies Association. Locked In, Locked Out examines race and class inequality as they are created, contained, and negotiated through urban policy, the physical built environment, and community gates in private and public housing. Dr. Dinzey-Flores is currently working on a number of projects. The first is a mixed method examination of how race is articulated in residential real estate practices in demographically changing neighborhoods in Brooklyn, New York. And the second looks at the transatlantic circulation of housing planning and design ideals in the middle of the 20th century. She is also collaborating on a mobile data project with department and university colleagues seeking to understand racial segregation as it occurs in motion, and a mixed media project on the construction of the Caribbean. Professor Dinzey-Flores has held fellowships at the University of Pennsylvania Institute for Urban Research, and also has been a fellow of the Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral program on race, crime, and justice, and at the Vera Institute for Justice. Since 2013, Professor Dinzey-Flores has been a board member of the mayoral appointed board of the New York City Housing Authority, and I would like for us to give them both a warm welcome to talk to us today. And before I actually end, which I will do very quickly, promise, I just wanted to say that after both of our speakers talk, we will have some commentary by two of our undergraduates here at Yale, Alejandro Comas-Short and Alondra Mejia. And I just briefly wanted to tell you that the reason why this is being done today here is because of students like them. They have expressed powerful, consistent interest in Afro-Latinidades of various kinds, as well as on Blackness in diasporic contexts. And specifically, they have been interested in anti-Blackness in Latinx communities, which is a topic that they raised in various informal and formal forums, and in which they have great both personal and academic intellectual interests. So I really appreciate them taking the time to be here as representative of other students who are likewise very interested in this topic. And I'll leave it at that. And Tanya Herńandez is going to start.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. I took advantage of 3 years at law school when I never went to the Beinecke. I went to the Beinecke for the first time today. It's quite lovely. So what I want to do is share a few words about the background of the book. Well, I thought it was up there. Anyway, my one meager attempt at media interpretation of... ¿Será que esto? Well, it's not really that important, but...
It's very strange because it was right. Can I sign it? You have to be the person that...
Whosever computer that is, it's not mine. So
This is why I never do a PowerPoint. All I have for you is just one image. That's it. The cover of the book.
Then if that's the case, you may have to...
And it's no problem to proceed without it.
That's weird. Yeah, that's not it.
Okay, no problem. Okay, I'll just close this then, so that you don't have distraction. Okay, so what I thought I would do is share a few words about the background of the book, Multiracials and Civil Rights, before I read a short excerpt for you. And it's about my own personal story. So you're getting a exposure to the book that I don't normally do in scholarly presentations, because I think my colleagues want that kind of business about me. They should buy the book. But for students, I have special love. I make special consideration of. So I've been a civil rights professor, lawyer, etc., for over 25 years. And yet, I was very confused when I started reading some commentary about the rise of people who identify as multiracial. That part didn't confuse me. Right? The part that confused me was an attribution that rise in this more fluid, nuanced, context-based form of identifying racially now meant that we needed a whole new civil rights. And the reason why that confused me is because it didn't seem in keeping with what I was observing. But I decided, you know what? Let me go take a look at these cases and see for myself what's going on, since these commentators are now sort of alerting me to a new dynamic. So I go back, I take a look at these cases, and what I see is that while there certainly is a presence of people who are now identifying as mixed race, and they say that before the court, where they say, hello, my name is X, and my racial identity is Y, and this is what happened to me. And when they begin with what happened to them, the mixed race identity then takes a back seat in their own stories. Their stories are about being unfairly treated, not based on merit, excluded from public opportunities of access, all because of them being lumped as non-white. Not about any particular form of their, I think meaning that their personal identity doesn't match up necessarily with what the more crude group-based form of treatment that they're receiving. Yet in this literature, right, of these commentators, courts are presumed to misunderstand the nature of discrimination against mixed-race persons. And this is one I wanted to better comprehend. So when I looked at all of these, I did it within the housing context, employment context, public accommodations, criminal justice, education, and in all of these various spheres, I found a very particular dynamic, right, that I'm going to describe to you. And with that dynamic, this focus on non-whiteness of any sort being problematic by those who want to discriminate, what I observed was a need for reinforcement of our current structures of civil rights and anti-discrimination law, as opposed to a justification for sort of rewriting the page. So let me sort of start with an excerpt from the book from the very beginning, where I look at how the multiracial stories that I dug into, because this is basically what I did. I looked at people's personal stories as evolved in court cases, but still their personal stories. And in looking at all those personal stories, I have to say that it sort of brought me back to my own as an Afro-Latina, mixed-race person, sort of navigating various tropes and pathologies of mestizaje, of racial mixture pride in Latino communities. And it seemed important to be transparent about how that background was informing my own analysis. Okay. Just before I begin, how many of you understand Spanish? Oh, good. Okay. So there's a couple of colloquialisms in here that I loosely try to translate, but if you all think there's a better translation, feel free to shout it out. Okay. So I'm going to start reading. I'm not doing it from the book itself because the font is too small. Okay. All these 25 years, they have taken a toll on the eyes. Okay, so I've got it all printed out nice in the big font. All right. I am the mixed-race daughter of a mixed-race mother, almost given away because of her blackness. In the 1940s, my maternal grandmother, Lucrecia, was a mixed-race country girl, right, or what her fellow Puerto Ricans called a jíbara, from a mountain village in Puerto Rico. Her African ancestry appeared slightly in what they described as a trigueña, light, wheat color, skin tone, but was not very apparent in her facial features or hair texture. Her older sisters were similarly light-skinned and favored their fair-complected mother more than their darker-skinned father. For this reason, Lucrecia and her sisters considered themselves a race apart from those who appeared more unambiguously Afro-descendant. Any tinge of color in the family was attributed to the long-ago legacy of Taino Indians on the island. And it was immaterial to the family that Taino Indians have been historically documented to have been exterminated by the Spaniards by the late 16th century, mid to late 16th century. When my grandmother Lucrecia fell in love with and united herself with a carpenter and a guitarist named Wang, her family was not pleased, not because of his profession, but because while he was a mixed-race grandchild of a former slave and a son of an Afro-Puerto Rican mother and white Spaniard, his race mixture appearance was what Lucrecia's family labeled as black and thus unacceptable. Puerto Rican identity may claim to celebrate racial mixture, but some of us are thought to look more mixed than others. Dark-skin deviations from the idealization of light skin with European features and straight hair are ejected from the Puerto Rican portrait of racial mixture. Lucrecia's family was no exception from this Puerto Rican and similarly Latin American anti-black conception of racial mixture. Lucrecia's second child, Nina, my mom, was born in the 1940s. And much of the dismay of Lucrecia's family, to them, the child was dark. Too dark. Too dark to count as racially mixed, and certainly too dark to pass as white or white Puerto Rican. Baby Nina did not thus pass the look behind the ears Caribbean test of seeking out the future darkness of infants, because you know our skin changes over time. Even more problematic, Nina's skin tone approximating that of 1940s African-American singer and actress Lena Horne, perhaps the Beyonce of her time for you millennials, would complicate the family's image as disassociated from blackness. Who is she? What is she to you, in other words? The campaign to send baby Nina away began in earnest. Lucrecia's family lobbied to have baby Nina placed for adoption with an African-American family. Any African-American family would do, so long as baby Nina was removed from the household. Only later, as an adult researcher, would I learn from a colleague how much the family impulse to return dark-skinned children like they are damaged goods in the foster care system in Puerto Rico when they become too dark was like what happened with my family. At the same time, the family's animus towards the Afro-Puerto Rican father that baby Nina favored did not extend to her older sister, Monica, with the same father. Why a difference? Monica, although sibling, was lighter in complexion, with long, straight hair. Monica's African ancestry, then, did not announce itself so loudly in her appearance, and she was immediately accepted by the family. The physical comparisons between the two sisters was a constant obsession of the family, with Nina, the dark one, being called Monito, little monkey, and Negrita Bembe, little black African-like girl, my best translation, while Monica was lovingly called La Nena, the little girl, the loving little girl. Nina's darker skin tone and African tresses were always viewed as problematic by the family. Her kinky curls, what they call pelo malo, bad hair, was a source of consternation that compelled Lucrecia's family to continually shave Nina's hair in the hope that it would grow out straighter. I told you they were country people. Any infraction of Lucrecia's rules of discipline were greeted with both a beating and an expression of regret for not having given her away to an African-American family at birth, along with a threat to place Nina in a foster home. Again, this was a marked contrast to the indulgence accorded to her older sister Monica, with the slightly lighter skin and, more importantly, pelo lindo, pretty hair, literally, more culturally better translated as good hair. The racialized distinctions between the two girls continued their entire lives. My own childhood experience with differential treatment based on however mixed or black someone perceived me to look on any given day or context only reinforce my understanding of the relevance of anti-black sentiment within celebrations of idealized notions of mixture amongst Puerto Ricans and others. My grandmother, Lucrecia, was never happier than when my hair was greased down into 2 long braids down my back, and I looked as what she fantasized an indigenous Taína would look like. But her absolute preference was for me to have my hair blow-dried straight, regardless of how short in duration the look would last. My curly girls in the room know what I'm talking about. One day in humid weather, maybe a week with some big rollers, dry air, nightly wrapping, for maximum stretch. However, the hair wars began in earnest with her when I cut off my hair in an act of adolescent independence, so much shorter than it is right now. My grandmother was mystified as to why I would choose to have my curls spring out on display in what resembled my mother's afro. In my grandmother's eyes, my mother was unfortunately afflicted with overtly bad hair. But why in the world would I choose to emulate that style when I had what she thought was the benefit of being better situated to beat my hair into submission with a more attractive, a simulation of whiteness? Every visit to her apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan was greeted with some version of, ay, ese pelo. Oh, that hair. O por qué no haces algo con ese pelo? Why don't you do something with that hair? Wearing my hair in a short curly mop also worked to seemingly eject me from my presumed membership in the Latino, Latinx, I'm with young people, imaginary. Encountering Latinx merchants and other Latinx service providers, I was now constantly greeted with a surprise. Oh, you speak Spanish? Where did you learn to speak Spanish? My hair now barred me and barred the door to my automatic entree to Latinx kinship. I now had to earn my way back into Latinaness by constantly speaking Spanish loudly and referencing my Latina culture. Like in Latin America, the imagined Latino community has and had a decided vision of mixture that does not encompass tightly coiled hair with brown skin. The anti-black slurs I also heard used in the Latino community with respect to African Americans only reinforced my early impressions that blackness was problematic despite our assertions of Latino pride and being a mixture of races. It became evident to me that our cultural mestizaje pride, race mixture pride notwithstanding, not all parts of the mixture were equally welcomed or celebrated. Even outside the family nucleus, I found that there was a politics to racial mixture that living in the multi-ethnic New York City of the late 1960s and 70s did not abate. I was blessed to have attended a very dynamic Head Start program located in the Midtown West neighborhood of Manhattan, then known as Hell's Kitchen. The backdrop for the movie and the play West Side Story, get a little image there? Okay. The preschool was incredibly diverse, right, and a delight to attend. However, when we all graduated preschool and entered into the local public elementary together, I was separated from my diverse group of friends. For the first 2 weeks of first grade, I found myself in a very chaotic classroom where we were often left unattended and where very little learning took place. This was the special education class of the 1960s. The class was filled with brown-skinned Latinos and African Americans I'd never met before. I was separated from my preschool best friend, Lizzie, with her sweet white Irish face. I was separated from my Puerto Rican buddy, Ruben, with his pale white skin. Nor were any of the other lighter-skinned Puerto Ricans from Head Start in special education class with me. When my mother discovered that something was not quite right about my elementary school learning situation, she intervened, I guess what we now call helicoptered in, and the school official claimed I was placed there because of my Spanish language education needs. This is an explanation that was most peculiar, given, one, the English-dominant African Americans in the class, and the absence of any bilingual education offered while I was there. Back then, there was not a public conversation about the school-to-prison pipeline, but there was certainly a penitentiary approach to warehousing difference. Only when my mother insisted that English was actually my primary language, and the language of my instruction in preschool, was I able to enter a mainstream classroom where actual teaching took place. Even after my escape, though, from the special ed of the 1960s, which was neither special nor an education, my New York City public school experiences continued to operate within a pigmentocracy, a hierarchy of color, where the racial mixture of Latinos was acknowledged, but closer approximations of whiteness were rewarded with presumptions of competence and intellect. This became especially clear to me when strangers did not know my Spanish surname or ethnic origin. They just saw the face and presumed that my black-white mixture was solely due to an African-American ancestry. After a lifetime of seeing how my mixed race and multi-ethnic status, multilingual status, did not shield me from the racism of our society, nor many others I have since been blessed to travel to, it came as a surprise to me to read the work of legal scholars and others proclaiming that mixed race racial discrimination was distinct in nature from the racial discrimination that non-multiracial identified persons experience. While certainly every individual perceives their racial discrimination as their own personal experience, I'm a lawyer, I get that. Each of my clients is unique. It's still a jolt to encounter the premise of the presumed uniqueness of the discrimination entirely against multiracial identified persons and its requirement that a new approach to civil rights be formulated. Because this presumption is such a disconnect from my own mixed race Puerto Rican experience, I began the journey of tracking down the multiracial accounts of racism for myself. The tale of why multiracial discrimination is thought to challenge traditional understandings of civil rights law has a lot to teach us about how to move towards a more egalitarian society. It's my hope that the insights I've found in examining the multiracial discrimination cases will be illuminating for you as well, whatever your own story of race may be. So that closes the excerpt. Do I have a few more minutes left, or should I close here? I do? Okay. So the book examines all electronically available anti-discrimination law cases with mixed race identified claimants. Right? So not every single person who has any racial mixture in their background. The inquiry, the focus of the research was on people self-identify with their mixed race status, because there's two different things. And I looked at their stories within the context of the workplace, school settings, housing discrimination, more about that later after Dr. Flores talks, right? Public accommodations, and criminal justice. And what I found in each of those contexts was a story after story of a very familiar white versus non-white bias. I want to share you a sample of a story from the book, right? So you don't just, oh, this book is just about her. No. So let me tell you about a woman named Jill Mitchell. Jill Mitchell describes herself as a light-skinned biracial woman with a black father and a white mother. She says that based on her appearance, many people presume that she's mixed. So they're looking at her like, something there, right? But she says when they guess, they often guess that she's a mix of some Latina with European ancestry. So she starts working for Champs Sports, sporting good chain. Her chain was in Beaumont, Texas, just to give you a little flavor. And she works there as a full-time management trainee. She works there for a whole year without any problems. She actually receives positive performance evaluations. But she felt that her entire work experience began to shift once her store manager discovered that her racial background, while mixed, was okay for a year as being mixed, but that it included African ancestry. Now, how did you find this out? She didn't disclose this on her job application. She didn't answer his question. You know, mixed race people get So what are you? She didn't answer that because it's not his business. It's also an illegal question, but in any case. So he doesn't know about her background from her. He figures it out, so to speak, when, after a year of working there, her family starts to show up after work to pick her up, give her a drive home, meet her at lunch, take her out to lunch, etc. And some of the family members who showed up were the darker-skinned members of the family. So when he did the question of who are they and what are they to you, and she says that they're family, his little brain works, and he comes to the logical conclusion, if you're not adopted, then I guess, boom, 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 oh, this is part of your background as well. So he deduces that her racial background includes some African ancestry. She says that his attitude towards her changed dramatically, those are her words, as he fixated on her African ancestry. He starts to make negative remarks to her about black people, and on one occasion, even sort of confronts her very directly as to why was it she was only dating black men. Right? He viewed that as problematic. A little intersectional analysis here. At one point, Mitchell overhears the manager stating, "We need to get her out of here." And sure enough, this racialized treatment of her continues until she is eventually demoted, and her former position is filled with a white employee who came not from the ranks of the established management trainee program, but from one of the part-time hires. That's like asking a boy in Stockholm to come up front now and be a manager. Okay. As a result, she attributes, logically, her demotion to race discrimination, and she files a claim. Now, her chances for winning her lawsuit were quite low, not because of the relative merits of her claim, but because it has been documented that very few complaints of racial discrimination in our contemporary times ever yield a success for claimants. The vast majority of racial discrimination cases are dismissed by courts without even the opportunity to get to trial. From 1979 to 2006, just to give you a quick little glimpse shot, federal claimants only won 15% of all job discrimination cases. And this is by comparison to all other civil cases, meaning non-criminal cases, where the win rate is 51%. Means they don't come back to me, oh, don't all people? No, not all plaintiffs lose. Okay? Commentators attribute the low success rate of employment discrimination or anti-discrimination law cases with the growing hostility with which courts approach allegations of discrimination. Right? Judges sort of seemingly believe that the passage of the civil rights laws alone have wrought a post-racial society in which instances of discrimination are rare. But despite the overarching challenge of persuading courts that an instance of discrimination had actually occurred, Jill files a motion for court-appointed counsel, and the court grants it. Let me step back for a moment, just give you a little law school preview for any of my pre-law people in the room. You are only entitled to an attorney in a criminal case. New York now has a little extra exception now for housing discrimination. That's separate. Across the nation, you only get a lawyer paid for by the government if you have a criminal case because your liberty is at stake. Civil cases, you're on your own. But she goes forward and she says, I need a lawyer, and I'd like for you to appoint one to me and for the government to pay for it. When I tell my legal colleagues about this, they're like flabbergasted. One, that she had the balls to ask for it, and two, that the court grants it. And he grants it with the notation that the merits of her claims weigh in favor of granting the motion. This is quite a victory in the context of the contemporary judicial animosity to any discrimination claim. Here, the court's sort of endorsing, sort of implicitly, the merits of her claim and expending an investment on the part of the government to allow her to have a level playing field, meaning have another lawyer talk to the employer's lawyer, right, to be able to talk power to power. Having the claimant have a lawyer has significant consequences, right, when you level this playing field. And as a result, there's a little conversation that takes place after this. She gets her lawyer appointed to her, and they settle the claim out of court, right? So meaning she is provided with some settlement to try to make her whole. Now, that is a win within the context, and here I'm going to close, of anti-discrimination law. Right? In short, here the judge is not confused, right, by her claim, right, nor by her biracial identity, and she's able to reach a satisfactory resolution of her case within traditional civil rights law. Now, at its core, her story is one about the societal bias against all non-whites, right, as opposed to anti-racial mixture bias. And that's the pattern in all the multiracial discrimination cases that I found. Now, what is interesting is that these commentators find the case problematic nonetheless. I look at all cases, but I start off with theirs in order to sort of see, when people are winning, why aren't they thinking that's a good thing? And the reason why they don't like this case, even though Jill wins, is because the court constantly refers to her as black. Right? He describes what her identity is, but then he oversimplifies her identity in his legal analysis. And for these commentators, that oversimplification is an indictment on what the court does. Right? Now, I'll close by simply saying, in a perfect world, it would be preferable for judges to reflect back to claimants the personal identity, right, that they set out at the outset, right, just as a matter of courtesy. But is it a legally flawed analysis when the court doesn't do so? Here, the judge focuses on her blackness in the same way that her story does. Put that in your hat and think on it. We'll talk more during the Q&A. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we can, is there a way to put it up or no? Not, I have my computer waiting in the. Oh, yeah, it's there. There's the cover. Beautiful cover.
I don't have a, so that's the problem.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. So that was a thrill to listen to, and I think many points of conversation in the presentation. I'm going to take a little bit of different approach, a rather academic approach. So bear with me here. I will get to myself sometime in the presentation, but I won't start there. Although that's where it all starts with me. As Tanya, Dr. Herńandez displayed, it starts with us, with each of us. So I work with buildings and space and built environments, and I try to understand how the built environment affects social dynamics, and I'm especially interested in racial inequality. I focus on the built environment not only in its form and how it physically affects things, but also symbolically, how people read it, what they read into it, and how race is sort of encoded in built environments. Today, I'm going to present on some patterns of the built environment in the Americas, and focusing primarily on Puerto Rico, but sort of generalizing to the Caribbean and Latin America, and how they formulate racial exclusion. And how in kind of performing race, the built environment, also formalizes a racial order that supposes that it's a democratic system, that race in Latin America and the Caribbean is liberal, and that is rather democratic. So the racial democracy. I guess my book, oh, there we go. So that's my book, Locked In, Locked Out, where I examine specifically the production of gates in public and private housing and how they do the work of segregating communities by physically building race, class, and gender inequality. In the book, I make a long argument for the ways in which race is codified in the built environment and how this violates the presumed liberal nature of the structure of race in Latin America and the Caribbean, the so-called racial democracy, which I am not gonna kind of like go full on to the description of race in Latin America and the Caribbean, except to say that there is a sense that there's an extensive mixture of races. Dr. Herńandez, some of her work speaks directly to this, and sort of like this mythic construction of a continuum where we're all the same and we all have we're all African, Spanish, and indigenous, and we get along well, and it's not like the US. Dr. Herńandez has particularly spoken to also the mythic creations that are involved in the U.S., right, in producing how the U.S. is also framed in ways that benefit this narrative of the racial continuum, the mestizaje, the rainbow people sort of discourse. So in my book, I challenge this by looking at the built environment. And so it's hard to know where it is. And so I look at privileged gated communities, which scholarship on gated communities tends to look at them, sort of like and how it informs their lifestyle. And these are communities in the city of Ponce in Puerto Rico. And I highlight how the form, the aesthetics of the gates, and the function, the way they work and who operates them and who manages them, are imbued with meaning of who belongs inside and who is supposed to be outside. And with few exceptions, most of the scholarship has sort of like forgotten that these gates also imagines an outsider. It's sort of like what happens, what's going on, what are they doing inside, but also, who are they referencing outside? It has been overlooked. But also that these gates operate in concert with other types of gate. And so I look also at these other gated communities. There's some animations here that I don't, can figure out, but that they weren't supposed to be there. But my book looks closely at this other side, and so this is the play on locked in, locked out, right? It depends on where you're standing, who you are, whether you're inside or whether you're out. So I look at these other sets of gates and the gates of quote-unquote the poor. Now, there's a lot of securitization around working class and sort of like named poor communities. And here I looked at how these gates in public housing, both, again, in form, in aesthetics, but also physically work to mark the communities as dangerous, not belonging, and in need of being controlled. So these are the gates of the poor. And so in the book, I try to kind of tease out the many ways in which they send this messaging. They create this messaging, they're branded as such, and the ways they reproduce segregation and inequality. So continuously making this contrast between sort of like the right side and the left side of those two images, a private community. And I look at two private communities and two public housing communities in the book. Now, the question is, many people understand this is a class discussion. This is about class. Where is race? Is race in there? So you may say that these gates, are about, don't really point to a racial hierarchy, and that tends to be the reading that is given in Latin America, the Caribbean, as in Puerto Rico, sort of like, it's not race, it's class. They're just different. So what I do in the book is invoke scholars like Diane Harris and others like Kevin Lynch, drawing from the work of Irving Goffman, other people like Gerald Sotos, Glenn Lowry, George Lipsitz, Catherine McKittrick, to highlight that race and racial inequality is also built in. It's made concrete in the built environment. So as Diane Harris says, that's the trick. Race hides in plain sight. Landscapes are particularly well suited to the masking of such constructions because they appear to be completely natural and neutral as well. But they're never thus. Architecture and landscapes are never thus. They are always powerful symbols and containers of cultural values, just as they simultaneously work to construct culture. So I'm really vested in understanding the built environment as a site that easily sort of like sends the message like, this is just a wall. Those are books, right? That's a door. But what kinds of racializing elements or produce that construction, and on the converse, how does it reproduce racial inequality? So now I bring you me. Because I must make a point here about epistemology. That's me there. I'm a 5-year-old there. This is a picture taking, I grew up in Puerto Rico, daughter of Dominican immigrant parents to Puerto Rico who had multiple migrations within the Caribbean, prior ancestral migrations within the Caribbean, including the Anglo, well, who knows what the Caribbean was during their forced or, work migrations, because they were sometimes in Dutch islands, sometimes in French islands, sometimes in British islands, depending on what era you're talking about. So, but growing up as a Black girl in Puerto Rico frames my analysis and it frames my scholarship. It's impossible for me not to see race and to see it from an epistemological, so phenomenological Blackness. And I'm thinking here of Fanon. So I first read Fanon when I was, at the other school that is sort of rival with you. A rivalry that I really don't, because, I have a different relationship. I'm the first person that got there in my whole world and universe. Probably will be the last, no legacies of grandeur, who do you support? So, so I'm not invested in that at all, but I had the fortune of going to the library, Widener Library, and going in there and finding Fanon on my own. And I read Fanon, and Fanon told me every single moment I had had since I had been 5 years old as a Black girl. So this is what Fanon said. Then assailed at various points the corporeal, and this sounds like crazy words, but schema crumbled, its place taken by a racial epidermal schema, nausea. That's when Fanon is called out on a trade. Mama, the Negro, that's the translation, it uses the word Negro. Mama, the Negro, look, the Negro. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in the development of its bodily schema, consciousness of the body solely a negating activity. It is a third-person consciousness because it creates a real dialectic between my body and the world. So the world comes through me in a Black body, and he speaks of this triple consciousness that then Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores take up in their Afro-Latino reader, a triple consciousness that builds on Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois' sort of double consciousness. I'm not only American and Black, I'm Latino. So here, the triple body is being, right? Like I am multiple. I am who I think I am, but I'm also who other people think I am and who other people think I am is attached to my body, to my racial schema, right? So it's not only about identity, but it's a racializing identity. It's what they call the phenomenological, right? It's attached to my body. So I say, this is my Black Latina epistemology, and I cannot undo, right, that for nonstop being a body started being a Black body, right, even to the self. And I want to turn it around because often this is misunderstood, and it's sort of like, well, can you be out of race? Can you, and sort of use this wonderful photographic project of inverting the world, right? Which I think this is a representation of when you encounter the world as a racial subject, right? If you turn it around, right, and whiteness was the other, right? Like, what would that feel like? Of course, this doesn't fully capture the relationship because we would have to really think about the way I encountered the world as a Black girl with white dolls. I mean, pretty, it's not like now. I don't know if you know what the world was like in 1980. But in 1980, we had no Black dolls. We had no Black Band-Aids. We had no Black nothing. Anyway, that was my world, at least in Puerto Rico. So to clarify, in the context of Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean. So we must take this into account. We're thinking about racial inequality and racial knowledges, racial scholarship. Because when I looked at this world of housing that was supposed to be natural and neutral, I saw race, even when it wasn't articulated. But it often was. So this is a supposed picture of a public housing project behind. And you have this writer, Edgardo Rodriguez Julia, who says, as he enters, he talks about going to a funeral of a famous singer, a Black singer. It's the funeral of Cortijo in the 70s. Well, is it 80s? It's 80s, actually, early 80s. And he says, I enter that cavernous den of iniquity, the projects, the legendary symbol of all the criminality on the face of our beauteous Puerto Rico, the projects, that anti-utopia, shares with that myth the virtue of a meaning that is both blurred and perfectly clear, terrifying in its concreteness, yet at the same time vague. And he talks about seeing them and saying they're watching me too, right? And they're reading me as a blanquito. He says this. I mean, he just says blanquito, but it's like a white guy. I think he says blanquito with a mustache, and they're also seeing me. So we're all seeing each other, and although it may not be acknowledged necessarily. This is another picture. This is actually Cortijo, who he attended the funeral. The representation of the caserío, which is the name for the public housing, as a Black space. Nobody's saying, don't hang out with Black people. Don't go to the caserío. Stay out of public housing. That's the space. So there's codified, right? Put up the gates because they're dangerous. Stay out of there. But similarly, this sort of natural, neutral landscape of housing shows its face also on the side of private urbanizaciones, middle and upper class communities. I don't know if I'll get but maybe let's see if this comes out. Oh, you're not connected to the internet. Okay, so I'm not even gonna go there. But I was gonna show you just one of the commercials that was running. Professor Ramos Sayas will recognize this. Yo tengo ya la casita. I now have the house that I always promised you. Between romance and flowers will form a home. The home you buy, the mortgage home, always comes clad in white images, right? Often, so that those who live there, who exist there, are white. Other sort of images reflect this. This is an image from early 1990s, and the reflection of who's the criminal, who's the dangerous person with the visiting partner, who's clearly Black, you know, in there, you know, sort of like threatening el pueblo, which is the public, represented. I mean, it might be a mixed race person. I mean, in this case, it might not, but still sort of like a polar opposites, right, with Blackness clearly as the dangerous. So these images are persistent. So that's one way to see it. When you look at the data, so if you go looking for it, you see other things. You see, like, I'll quickly go through this complex table, but basically public housing, private housing, public and private housing together, so the sum of this. And what turns out is that most people in urbanizaciones that I interviewed tended to say, we're white, or some form of white, more mixed on the public housing caserio side, but still rather, you know, a slew of people holding out to Black identities, some, and also mixed or other identities. This is based on census figure. When you look at segregation, we see, and I'm just going to point out because we can look at many things. We see that this is a measure of segregation. It's not that people are segregated, Black versus white, but white people tend to be rather isolated. So they get to spend time in white worlds in the context of Puerto Rico. And then I've done this kind of calculation. If you were going to highlight white, Black, other race, and more races in different SES characteristics, so I look here at unemployment, household income, poverty, and different kind of levels of education towards the bottom, and looking at the differences, so these are the mean percentages, and this is whether the difference between white and Black is significant, white and other significant, white and other, white and two more races is significant, Black and other. So sort of comparing some two one-on-one comparisons. And what this shows, I mean, just look at the white-Black differences, all significant. Meaning that in unemployment, in household income, in poverty, in education, there are differences, right? So typically, whites tend to be doing better, Blacks tend to be worse. There are less differences between, for example, so white and others still, many differences, so whites are completely distinguished from these other groups. Blacks tend to not that different than others, at least in these measures, and somewhat different from two or more races people, so from the mixed people, which kind of sort of is an interesting conversation, kind of dialogue with your findings. So the point I want to make here is that we think of this racial continuum, right? As like we don't know what to classify, but when it comes to thinking about racial inequality, it might be that there are binaries being imposed, right? Created. So I want to think about race in the Caribbean and Latin America rather than for the purpose of racial inequality, as rather than a continuum, as a system of racial binaries, where the line might be drawn lower or higher depending on the particular situation. Certainly whiteness carries some power right here, as does Blackness, right? So even as we think of like, oh yeah, but trigueño, or but the, you know, el jabao, like where do these other terms fit in particular situations? They move here or they move there, but you know where these people are? They're not going to the top in any kind of configuration. And those people at the top are not coming down in any configuration of the situation. Again, I'm talking here about social kind of like dynamics, right? Systemic, structural dynamics, rather than like how people feel or how they identify. So consequences for housing, for education, for employment, for example. So I have kind of like versions of those situations and how those move, but I won't talk about it. Things that show up spatially. People try, this is for Kingston, this is from the Portes and et al. Book on Caribbean cities. And, often these are mapped according to income. The point here is if we know that income is aligned with race, how do you think this looks? And how segregated they are. So if you look at these cities, they are rather segregated. There are very few places that are sort of mixed. The mixed here are they didn't do mixed here, but some of these have like medium and high income. This is Guatemala. I'll just quickly go, this is not a good map, but this one is not a good image, I should say. It's a great map. It's just my image is bad, but I wanted to highlight it because Kingston here, they do race and color in here, and then you're able to see some of them. This is Paramaribo, which also shows sort of segregation, and here they do Creole, sort of like an ethnic breakdown of the city. What I'm trying to show here is that if we look for them, if we understand race, and I'm looking for it. No, I'm not going to make mistakes. We see that there is a racial distribution, right, that aligns around inequality. And we can continue to see it. This is El Faro a Colón in Dominican Republic, which was built to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Christopher Columbus to the Americas, a project that took a century to make happen. And the Faro a Colón is made into a landscape, right, where you have to hide the close-by communities behind the wall. So race is there. It's not only class, it's race also that is actualized in these constructions. This is in Lima, Peru, interestingly enough. La muralla de la vergüenza is el muro de la vergüenza in DR. Here is la muralla de la vergüenza, which separates sort of irregular, they call it settlements, but squatter settlements from the rest of the city. Actualized, right? I mean, just the symbolism. We think of it, that's a wall, it's a wall. Upper class people, but look at the representation of who the residents of either side of the wall are. So here again, we see sort of like this binary, right? In the built form, it's not like you can live in between, right, in the wall or in between, but there are rather stark distinctions being made between, better or worse, good and bad, white and black, whatever, or non-white, white, black, non-black. Here's a very popular image. It doesn't look that well here. It looks okay, but there it doesn't look that great. But actually, somebody's using it for the book. Very excited about Hugo Cerón's book that uses this image about Mexican golf clubs. But here this is from Brazil, Sao Paulo, I believe, and it shows this stark distinction, right, between quote-unquote favela and upper class exclusion. But they're everywhere. If you look through security points, who does it profile? Who does it look? Who is it keeping out? Who it's not? I'm not going to play this video, but it's a great video. I recommend you look it up. Carlos Angulo in Colombia, going through the city and noting how he's always stopped. And he gets very pissed off in this video. It's a fantastic video. I highly recommend it. Because for Black bodies in Latin America and the Caribbean, they're always, right? It feels like a binary. It feels like that Fanonian moment. And it's documented. Okay, I'm just going to get here. And so the question is, if we rethink this continuum into binaries, how does it look like? So here's the case of Brazil, who was like, okay, we're going to do affirmative action, those who are black. There was very low enrollment of black Afro-Brazilians in higher education, and they did a formal policy program. We're going to bring in Afro-Brazilians, and they're going to, kind of like increase the numbers. What happened? Suddenly, everybody was black, right? Like all the mixed race people were like, this is my way in. And so I love these because then they were like, wait a second, we have to figure this out. So as the mixed race country grapples with its legacy of slavery, affirmative action race tribunals are measuring skull shape and nose width to determine who counts as disadvantaged, right? So we go to this place where we have to figure out who are the people that are benefiting or not benefiting from these racial orders that are, kept sort of complex and hard, but that also in their complexity and hard to understand reproduce inequality. So these spots are for people who are phenotypically blacks, and one history major and a member of student activist group told me it's not for people with black grandmothers. And that's the difference. That's what we have to figure out, right? How to address blackness in ways that's responsible to the actual social dynamics that are reproducing inequality. But in a country as uniquely diverse as Brazil, where 43% of citizens identify as mixed race, Tanya, and 30% of those who think of themselves as white have black ancestors, it's not immediately clear where the line between race should be drawn, nor who should get to draw it, and using what criteria. So if addressing, racial inequality requires coming to terms with the structure of race, right? The structure on which those privileges and those penalties are distributed, what do we do then? When it's not about identity, oh yeah, you can be whatever you want, right? But if you walk, right? When are you encountered with the phenomenological, right, reality of a racial bodily schema? So that's my sort of question moving forward. And so my work is trying to say these built structures, they're not like you can tear them down. I cannot walk through the wall. I want to walk through the wall. But that's the very same way in which racial structures exist, even if they're perceived to be invisible and rather liberalizing. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
So now we'll have a very brief intervention by Alondra and Alejandro and open it up for questions. So they will just maybe make the comments and then take the questions.
Well, I was going to thank you both for being here so much. This is amazing. And so I kind of wanted to start the Q&A, but I don't know. Okay. So I guess my first question is for both of you. I guess what are some challenges in researching anti-Blackness through these larger structures, space, and law, especially when there's a personal, I guess, relation to this larger topic? So, yeah. Sorry.
So the challenge for the researcher?
Yeah, of the research in like studying anti-Blackness, especially in these really large structures, especially when there are some personal ties to or relation to the Blackness structure itself. The way it's reproduced in Latin America and in the U.S.
Well, I guess what I want to do is respond to that in a very lawyerly way. And what I mean by that is this, and picking up immediately, right, where Dr. Dinzey-Flores left off, right? This idea of, how does Brazil deal with affirmative action in this racialized hierarchy, et cetera? Well, it was as you put that out there that I started to reflect back how what the legislators and what many universities have done, but then there was a federal law that came down. Anyway, that much detail you don't need. But what they did in response was incorporate the built racial constructs, right, the physicality of racialization into their affirmative action policy. What do I mean by that? Rather than only focusing on race identity, the affirmative action cases for higher education look at allocating a significant number of spaces for those who come from public high schools, which majority of the white elite don't attend. And so that racialized space, without having to engage in this like measuring someone's head, none of that nonsense, right? Which sort of feels very, antebellum, right? To say the least. So it takes the built environment, and this was an idea, this was an idea of the Black social justice movements. I mean, their response to when people say, oh, well, how can you be asking for policies of social inclusion based on race when nobody knows who anybody is and we're so mixed, blah, 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 right? And their like little quip is, just ask a police officer, right? They always know, right? They always know because they're busy racially profiling and they figure it out. That's, a somewhat little offhand way of responding, but what it encapsulates is this idea of it's not that complicated when you become very pragmatic at looking at the effects of group-based racialization. The indicators are there, right? We've saw a beautiful display of that in this body of research. And so, yes, it's a challenge, but yet only, I think, when people, and it's all tied to my own stuff, when people overly focus on trying to sort of understand racism by reducing it to the personal, right? When it's just only about you and how you feel in any given space. That's not unimportant, but it doesn't actually illuminate how racism operates, which is unconcerned about your personal identity and solely focus on how to racialize you as not belonging.
I would second everything you said. I think that one of the challenges that precisely this concern with sort of like people's feeling about it, or identity, which is heightened for good reasons often in the Caribbean and Latin American setting, that we're all one nation and it was attached to national projects, right? Anti-colonial projects that required sort of like a tight and population. The challenge in focusing on that is also that we don't produce the data. We don't produce the type of information that will allow us to tease out these inequities. And so, I do built environment, and the question is like, and that's why I started talking about this epistemological piece. It's like, I don't see race there. That's not race. That's just like, in the same way that when people have experiences, it's like, how do you know that was about race? It's like, well, I think it was. And, how do you actually provide the evidence for it? And so I think that there's also it's probably not the best word for it, but there's a hegemonic production of that dictates what data counts and what data is important. Oh, sorry. Oh, so I'll stop. I'll stop so that you can have. So that's it. That's it.
Okay.
Open it up to the floor.
Okay. So
Or ask it and then have more questions, and then we can figure out how we can.
Yeah, let's do it.
and he's coming to dinner with us.
I can ask later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So I wanted to ask, sort of, thinking about Richard Flores, for example, and this idea to create a capital in cities, cities are urban cities have gone through a major upheaval, both in terms of its demographics, but also its built social natural environments. How do we read this binary, or is this binary no longer becoming does it no longer have utility in a post-racial sort of state, right? How do we see that and read that? And certainly in the U.S., but maybe you sort of look at this self-centered.
Do we want to take another question?
So maybe we can take a couple of questions and then you guys can together. So there was another question up there, yeah.
Gracias, Mary. Boricua aquí también. I just, so growing in Puerto Rico, I'm here, and the issue of race, and thank you for also being transparent and sharing about your background, because there's a lot we can, that's a first hermeneutical lens, so I really appreciate that. One of my struggles is growing up in Puerto Rico, studying here, and I'm so glad you talked about the binary, because I hear a lot of the black and white binary here is very, very strong. And so I just wonder, and yet there's racism in Puerto Rico, there is, but how does that affect even what we do and how we see reality, because we talk about race, but we don't talk about ethnicity, and I really love that slide that you have with ethnicity. So ethnicity, you then incorporate language, and there's linguistic racism there, and there is, so anyway, I'm just trying to figure out what are the benefits of that, and how you kind of also maybe limit our scholarship if we also just see black and white, and we see other people also being in the mix in this big empire that we live in. So
Okay. Cool. And one more, and then they can take it collectively, choose how to. Third one. Okay, actually, so then we can those two, and then.
Well, I can be very brief on this one. I sort of see the two questions asked as related to each other, so I'm just going to one response. And then sort of, what is the black-white binary still even relevant today? If it is relevant, does it have some negative influences in that it obscures other intersections, other vectors of and sources of inequality? Right? And I think everything we've talked about today suggests that the binary is still relevant. You don't want to call it black-white if that indicates to you a sense of only African-American and only European white, then let's rename it. I'm not tied to it, right? But if what we understand as blackness and whiteness is more than just African-American and European whites, and we understand that the way it operates is about an in-out, equal, unequal mode of analysis, I think it's actually very relevant in how we see socioeconomic status arrayed, and also relevant for analysis and trying to combat it. How then do we deal with some of what some might view as a negative consequence of hiding other vectors of discrimination? Well, in my world, discrimination. We include them, right? This idea of doing multivariate analyses for the social science people in the room, right? Yes, it makes things more complicated, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. Right? You can look at gender and race. You can look at race and color. There's lots of ways to deal with these things, and not have a response that means, oh, we've moved beyond and we're so post-racial that binaries are no longer in operation. Because when we get rid of that language, my fear, and we've seen this sort of before the civil rights movements begun in Latin America, that it is a form of currency that then undermines the ability to even voice and name what's going on. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you name post-raciality, right? Because to begin with, I think to think of inequality, to not think about inequality benefits from thinking that it's complex and hard, and yet, as you say, like a cop knows, and we know what our prison population looks like, right? And we know that communities who benefits, sort of like in the richer Florida, who benefits, right, from this new kind of order of the city that is highly entrepreneurialized, right? Who has access to funds, who doesn't. Here I'm not suggesting that the binary is sort of like a racial schema, or only a racial schema. I'm suggesting that schemas are laid out in binaries in ways that says who benefits and who is penalized. And so if we think about that beyond our concern with whether it represents all of us, right? Like, is that capture my Black grandmother as it, right? I mean, does it capture it? Well, in this instance, your Black grandmother is irrelevant, right? Because you might be able to walk into a place that the person who is actually, themselves Black would not be able to walk. So it's sort of like, I'm thinking about it not as a strict, and that's why I say it's moving and it's plural, right? Like it's plural in that different situations call for different things. So that's what I'm thinking here. It doesn't restrict ethnicity from participating in that, right? And why are we going to think it's like, let's say, a Dominican in Puerto Rico, we're going to think we have to take into account that they're Dominican if they blend into whiteness, Puerto Rican style. Does that matter in that instance? It likely doesn't. Of employment, let's say, if it's race, that's really at the heart of the sort of like what's going on with regards to employment, then we get at that. Right? So it's not about sort of oppression politics or competing kind of like privileges, but what are the operative kind of dimensions, social dimensions that reproduce inequality, and how thinking of it binarily, because it operates, right? People are excluded or included. How might we use it to address inequality?
That's great.